Here on the screen I have the Android emulator. We'll be using the emulator for most of the demos that we do here. Things to keep in mind though is that if you've done much Android development, you know that the emulator is a reasonable facsimile of a device. It's not just like a device. So as we go through things and we look at various behaviors, along the way I'll point out things that may look one way on the emulator that will look differently on the device. And I'll touch on those as we go along. Now looking at this application, it's a very, very simple application, right? It's just got an activity. It's got the title bar on the activity. I've got one widget on here, which is just a text view. Right, and I've also got my pop-up menu, which says a do work option, and exit app. Right, so it's about as simple as it can be. If we look at the code back here, right, I've got my initial activity, which we're just calling my activity. It's got all the standard things you have in an Android application. It's got an on create, the layout, the view. I get a reference to that one text view there. The main thing is that I've got my menu handler here. Right? And my menu handler, I have the do work and the quit, the two menu options that we had. And this do work is where we're going to see what happens when we do things that take too long. Right? So if we go down to the do work function here, what I've done is I've created a very simple worker class. And it breaks out some common things that people often want to do on an Android platform. One thing you might want to do is get the current location. In other words, what's the GPS coordinates of where my device is right now. As nice as GPS coordinates are, most of us don't think very well in 6-digit decimal values. So it's nice to have a real address. So the next thing we do is we do what's called reverse geocode. We take that latitude and longitude and find out what the address is for it, right? Just kind of the human readable address. And then what we want to do is we want to save that somewhere, right? So they're the operations that we're going to want to perform. Right? And let's take a look at the implementation behind these. Now the first thing is get location. Right? All I do there, get location, is I get the location manager, get the GPS provider, right? And then from that I just get its last known location. In other words, I'm not going to bother in this demo spinning up the GPS. I'm just going to say, you know what, whatever the last set of coordinates you had were, that's good enough. So we get those. In terms of reverse geocoding, we're going to use the Android class called the geocoder, right? That allows us to pass in a latitude and longitude, and it does the work for us to go ahead and get the human readable address for that. Important thing to remember is that an Android device obviously doesn't have every geocoordinate of every single thing in the entire country or world on it, right? Classes like this geocoder are actually going out to the network, right? It's actually going out there and making calls to a network service provided by Google to get that information. So this little, 2 lines of code here of create a geocoder and saying, go get me the address for it, right? That's a call that could ultimately end up taking a couple of seconds, right? Because depending on the network activity, depending on congestion, depending on the kind of network you have. So there's the kind of things we have to watch out for. And that last function, save, actually save this information. Again, do something we commonly want to do in the Android platform, is I want to store this file out on the SD card, right? In order to do that, the API says I should call get external storage public directory. In other words, ask the operating system, where on that SD card should I store this? The place we locate all kind of generic files is in what's called the downloads directory. So I get that downloads directory. All I do over top of that is create a file over it, create a buffered file over it, and just write some information out to it. Something that's important to keep in mind here when we're writing out to the file system. Although Android devices have these kind of, these great kind of CPUs inside of them, and some of them are even kind of multi-core now, and they're really performant, something that people don't often realize is that many Android devices actually have a single-threaded file system. That's right. That means that the file system is engineered in such a way that at some point in time, only one thread can be active in that file system at a time. Right? There's a lot of technical details behind that, but it has a lot to do with the way it manages the SD layouts and so forth. But that's important because what that means is that you can have an application that does work against the file system and responds really, really well most of the time. But every once in a while accessing the file system, it'll hit a small delay of maybe a few hundred milliseconds, or a second would probably be a lot, but a few hundred milliseconds would not be uncommon. And that would actually exceed that 100 millisecond mark we're trying to deal with. So writing out to the file system, again, is another issue we want to be careful with because it can really affect the user experience, right? So these are the problems that we're going to have to deal with here. Now, a couple of notes about the way I've implemented this particular set of classes here that we're using to actually demonstrate behavior. One thing I've done is just for demonstration purposes, every one of these functions has a simulate delay call inside of them. This just adds a couple second delay to it, just so it makes it easier for me to talk through the problems that we run into as we're dealing with things here. The other thing is, and this alludes back to a point I made a minute ago, is that there are differences between emulators and devices, right? Devices tend to have a pretty consistent behavior. One of the cool things about Android is that emulators are very, very configurable. You can kind of decide what features you have on them and so forth. And sometimes getting things like the GPS working in the emulator or getting some of these Google services like the reverse geocoder working in the emulator can be a bit of a headache. So what I've done for the purposes of this demo to make it easier for you to kind of run these demos at home is that I've expanded the behavior just a little bit here, and I'll just touch on this very quickly. You'll notice that I've got a constant here, use GPS to get location. If you're running on an emulator, you probably want to just go ahead and set that to false, unless you know you've got all your GPS stuff set up right. Otherwise, if you don't do that, the emulators will often give you back a null location. If you're running on a device, just go ahead and set that to true, and you'll get the real GPS location. Right, not a problem. Also, on the reverse geocoder, I call the geocoder class, again, depending on the configuration of your emulator, oftentimes you'll get a service not available on that. So what I've done for the purposes of this demo is that if trying to get the geocoder fails with this IO exception, which is what happens when a service is not available, I've actually written the code for us to actually go out and run to that web service directly. Right? So if you look down here, I've got this reverse geocode with web service. Basically, if you look at that function down here, this actually does all the work to make the HTTP call out to the Google service. Basically, this is doing explicitly what that geocoder class does implicitly, which is all that network activity. And the last thing, and this is kind of a little thing, but it's important to be aware of. Excuse me, scroll back up here. So you notice here in Save, I've got this here, assure that directory exists. Again, one of the frustrations sometimes with the emulator is it doesn't lay out the file system exactly as you expect. All of your, most of your Android devices out there, whenever you say get external storage, public directory, whatever directory the operating system gives back to you is already created. In the case of Android devices, sometimes those directories aren't created. So this little function I wrote here just takes a look at your environment. If the standard directory isn't there, it goes ahead and creates it for us. Right, so these are just all extra things we've got inside the code here to make it easier for you to run this at home on your emulators. Right, but fundamentally, what we're really interested in doing here is getting our current location, or excuse me, getting a recent location, reverse geocoding that so we take a latitude and longitude and turn it into a human readable address, and then save it to a public area on our SD card. Right? So let's go ahead and just run this now. Remember, we've got to run inside of our emulator. All right, so when I go do work, I click on that. Now you see what's happening there, right? Is that because these are all slow operations, right? My whole UI here is frozen up now. As the user, right? It's very non-responsive, right? So that's exactly what we don't want to use, right? In fact, you can see here is that in this case, we're even running into problems with it because it's taking too long. Do I want to force it to close, right? So they're the things that we want to watch out for. And that's what we're going to look at through the rest of this course is how to prevent that particular set of problems from happening.